One minute, it was the engine that no industry could do without. The next, it was blacklisted and boxed away like a dirty secret. This is the story of the Detroit Diesel's 16V149 TIB. A V16 diesel war engine, so monstrous it could power a small army, yet so controversial it got banned before it could make its mark. What exactly made this mechanical giant so infamous? Who decided enough was enough, and why? Did the world miss out on an engine that was way ahead of its time? Stick around, because we're about to unpack the specs, stories, and all the surprises the DDV16 war engine holds. You are not ready for what's coming. Now let's start from the very beginning. The late 1960s and early 70s were a time when big, brutal diesel engines were the rock stars of the industrial world, and Detroit Diesel was part of the small crowd pulling the heavyweight. It was already a legend for its Series 71 and Series 92 engines. You heard right, it had fully dominated the scene long before the creation of 16V149 TIB. Its classic 8V71 and 12V71 series engines were widely used in everything from trucks and buses to military vehicles and marine applications. These were solid performers, reliable and well understood. At the same time, many competitors were using four-stroke diesel engines, which had different characteristics. They were generally more fuel-efficient and cleaner running, but sometimes lacked the raw grunt the two-stroke Detroit diesels could provide. All of these engines were well and good, but something was definitely missing. And someone had to fix it. This was the height of the Industrial Revolution, and the Cold War was still in full swing. So it wasn't surprising that the military and marine sectors were hungry for more power, more torque, and more importantly, engines that could last longer and perform harder under the most demanding conditions. So once again, like the giant it was, Detroit Diesel answered the call by pushing the limits of diesel tech with a new engine idea. It wanted to deliver a workhorse that could handle massive loads, harsh environments, and long runtimes without breaking a sweat. So it decided to build the 16V149 TIB, a 90-degree V16 monster with a two-stroke. The one engine that would make heads turn and torque wrenches spin faster. It was essentially a beefed-up, turbocharged, and intercooled evolution of the previous big block diesels, designed to deliver more muscle in a relatively compact package. The idea was crazy enough, and the execution brought crazy to a whole new level, because it definitely happened. Detroit Diesel had several plants, but the main production for this powerhouse was at their Detroit facility, known for cranking out those big, heavy-duty diesel engines that powered everything from trucks to military hardware. Given the engine's complexity and size, production was highly specialized, and they had the expertise and tooling to build such a beast in the Motor City, the heart of American industrial might. Behind the scenes, Detroit Diesel's engineers worked overtime, mixing old-school know-how with cutting-edge turbocharging and intercooling technology. Of course, they made it work. This is why the TIB in the name stands for Turbocharged Intercooled and Blower. This basically means this engine was breathing supercharged air like it was a gym rat on a protein shake binge. It was designed to be a powerhouse for big rigs, boats, military vehicles, and even generators. Now, as for how many were made before the ban, that's a bit trickier, because this engine was primarily used in military and specialized industrial applications. Exact production numbers are kind of a well-kept secret. Estimates suggest that a few hundred to maybe a couple thousand units were built during its run, mostly between the late 1970s and early 1990s. It wasn't mass-produced like car engines. This was a niche, high-performance machine tailored to a very specific, heavy-duty need. The sheer size of the Detroit Diesel 16V149 TIB was intimidating enough, but the numbers that it bragged about were what got people talking. It literally declared itself a beast in every sense. It was a two-stroke 90-degree V16 with a ridiculous 24.4 liters of displacement. That's 1,491 cubic inches of pure chaos. Twin turbos, intercooler, the whole 9 yards. At full tilt, it could push out up to 2,700 horsepower, mostly in military and marine setups. And torque? Yeah, we're talking over 6,000 pound-feet easy, depending on how you tuned it. It liked to spin a little faster than the big industrial guys too, running comfortably between 1,800 and 2,100 RPM. And sure, it wasn't exactly light, it tipped the scales somewhere between 5,000 to 7,000 pounds. But with numbers like that, no one was asking it to be graceful. But it wasn't just a numbers monster on paper. This thing actually showed up and delivered. But that might be hard to understand, so let's break down the numbers. First off, this was a 2-stroke V16 diesel. This already puts it safely in unicorn territory. Most big diesels today play it safe with 4-stroke cycles because they're cleaner, easier on emissions, and generally more tame. But the 2-stroke? That's the wild card. It fires every single revolution, which means more explosions per minute and a whole lot more muscle for its size. Think of it like the rowdy cousin at a family reunion who doesn't stop talking. It's always doing something. The 16 cylinders, packed neatly in a 90-degree V, it is kind of the engineering sweet spot. Smooth operation, better balance, and surprisingly compact, for something that could double as a small building. Which is exactly what the Detroit Diesel 16V149 TIB was going for. It's like cramming an entire weightlifting team into a studio apartment and still leaving room for snacks. The displacement? A ridiculous 1,491 cubic inches. That's 24.4 liters, which is basically the size of some car engines, multiplied by 5. It was inhaling air and guzzling fuel like it was trying to win a prize for it. And that's not just for fun. The more air and fuel it could cram in per stroke, the more firepower it pumped out. And trust me, when this thing fired, it didn't whisper, it roared. Let's talk power. With up to 2,700 horsepower, it didn't just move heavy stuff. It launched it. For comparison, your average modern diesel semi puts down maybe 500 to 600 horsepower. This one, like strapping 5 semis together and saying, let's ride. And the torque, over 6,000 pound-feet, that wasn't just excessive, it was surgical. It's the twist that gets things going from zero, and this thing had enough twist to yank the Earth off its axis. Okay, maybe not, but you get the idea. Your modern heavy-duty truck pulls around 2,000 pound-feet? This did triple that and didn't break a sweat. Now, how did it pull off that kind of power magic? Remember those turbochargers we mentioned earlier? They used not one, but 2. They crammed more air into the cylinders than nature ever intended. Then an intercooler steps in like a bouncer. Cools down all that hot compressed air so it's denser, cleaner, and ready to boom. And just in case that wasn't enough, they slapped on a blower too. Basically a mechanical pump forcing even more air in, like the engine was breathing through a fire hose. And here's a fun twist. This monster spun up to 2,100 RPM. Fast for a diesel of this size. Most lumber around at 1,200 to 1,800 RPM. This one had energy. It was like the Sprinter of the heavy diesel world. Big, angry, and faster than it had any right to be. But it didn't wear itself out. It was built tough enough to handle the extra speed without grenading every time someone hit the throttle. Of course, it weighed a lot, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 pounds depending on setup. But in the industrial engine world, weight equals durability. It's like carrying extra armor. And when you're powering tanks, cargo ships, or mining rigs, lightweight isn't exactly a compliment. You don't want sleek and sexy, you want built like a tank, and this was it. Stack it up next to its rivals? Caterpillar's big boys were solid, no doubt, but they usually capped out under 2,000 horsepower and offered less torque. Good engines, but the Detroit Diesel 16V149 TIB just had more muscle on tap. It was like comparing a heavyweight champ to a gym rat. Both strong, but only one's clearing the ring. A heavyweight with all that power wasn't built for pretty much any kind of machinery. You don't just slap a 7,000-pound V16 into a lawnmower and call it a day. No, this engine was made for the 1% of the 1% across all industries. It was like the muscle car of heavy-duty engines, but for really big machines. You didn't just find it in one type of equipment. This engine was everywhere power mattered. First off, military vehicles loved it. We're talking armored personnel carriers that had to rumble through rough terrain without breaking a sweat. Even some tanks and combat support vehicles rocked versions of this engine because it packed serious torque and horsepower. Plus, its marine roots meant it was perfect for landing crafts and other amphibious boats that needed reliable juice to get in and out of tricky spots. Speaking of boats, it powered all sorts of marine vessels from tugboats, not just your average river pushers. We're talking about deep water workhorses that had to pull container ships backwards into ports during storms. Then patrol boats, small commercial ships, and even some fishing boats, but not just any kind. Then, on land, heavy construction gear like bulldozers and cranes used it because they needed non-stop power to move earth and steel. Mining equipment? Absolutely. This engine could handle the harshest conditions down in the mines, powering drills and haul trucks. Oh, and let's not forget power generation. Emergency generators, oil field compressors, you name it. So who killed? The 16 V149. TIB and why? For an engine that had once been the rock star of heavy industry, powering everything from tanks to tugboats, you'd think it had a ticket to ride forever. It was everywhere. If you needed big power, deep torque, and something that sounded like a mechanical thunderstorm, the Detroit Diesel 16V149 TIB was the go-to choice. So naturally, no one saw its downfall coming. This was an engine that ruled. Untouchable, right? Wrong. Because by the early 2000s, that same mighty engine was suddenly persona non grata. Not just phased out, but frowned upon. If you still had one in your machine, people started giving you side eyes like you were letting off toxic smoke signals. Because, well, you kind of were. The reason for this sudden development was almost too simple, and somehow that's what made it worse. It wasn't a performance, it wasn't reliability, it wasn't even cost. Nope. The V16 was taken down by something far less exciting: emissions regulations. To put that in context, the world changed, and this engine didn't come along for the ride. The diesel game was shifting hard, cleaner, quieter, smarter. Those were the new rules. And this engine, as beastly and beloved as it was, had none of those words in its resume. It drank fuel like a frat boy at an open bar and puffed black smoke like it was going out of style, which, ironically, it was. Suddenly, all that glorious smoke and deep-chested roar? That wasn't cool anymore. That was pollution. And just like that, the king of torque got kicked off the throne. Now, Detroit Diesel could have re-engineered the whole platform. They could have modernized the emissions system, added aftertreatment, maybe even gone hybrid. But it would have cost a fortune, and frankly, the world was already moving on. More efficient four-stroke diesels with computer-controlled fuel injection were taking over. Caterpillar, Cummins, MTU, they all had newer platforms ready to roll. So rather than redesign the beast, Detroit Diesel, now under the Daimler umbrella, let it go. The 16V149 TIB was quietly retired from production. No press conference, no parade, just phased out. Today, when you hear about the Detroit Diesel 16V149 TIB, the first thing that pops up is usually its environmental baggage, the big reason it got the axe. But a lot of people argue that pollution was just one part of the problem. There was more. To begin with, the maintenance. Imagine handling a V16 diesel engine that's basically the size of a small car's engine bay, or more like the size of a small car itself. The 16V149 TIB wasn't exactly a pop the hood and check the oil kind of ride. These engines demanded constant attention. Routine checks were no joke. A slip in oil pressure or turbo lag could mean hours of troubleshooting. And with its two-stroke design, timing had to be perfect to keep things running smoothly. Miss a beat and you'd hear the engine cough and sputter like it had a serious hangover. Reliability? Well, if you kept up with the maintenance schedule, it was a powerhouse. But neglect or rushed repairs in the field, common in military or marine use, could turn it into a stubborn beast. Parts weren't cheap or easy to find, and specialized knowledge was a must. You couldn't just hand the keys to any mechanic. Fuel efficiency was practically an afterthought. The 16V149. TIB drank diesel like it had something to prove. It was built for power, not sipping fuel politely. Then came the heat. Pushing that kind of horsepower packed into a tight block meant serious thermal output. Cooling systems had to work overtime. Fall behind even a little and components could start cooking. And the sound? It roared. Add some vibration to that, and you had a machine that was physically impossible to ignore. In battlefield or shipyard settings, that wasn't a deal breaker, but it was no one's idea of refined. Still, these weren't flaws, they were the trade-offs of power. The engine delivered exactly what it promised. In fact, It offered so much that the clean, emission-free engines of today still have a lot to learn from, and unsurprisingly, a lot of them take their creation cues from it. You could say it was the engine world's bad boy who taught the nerdy kids a few things, and there was a lot to learn. First, its sheer displacement and power pushed boundaries no one really dared to push before. Remember, 24.4 liters of raw diesel muscle, if it isn't something you just shrug off. This big V16 laid down a gauntlet for what big block diesels could do, and in doing so, forced engine makers to rethink performance benchmarks. The lesson? If you want serious grunt, you can't just slap on turbos and call it a day. You need robust architecture and gutsy engineering. Today's heavy-duty engines like the Caterpillar C175-20 or the Cummins QSK95 owe some respect to the 16V149 TIB's legacy. They're not just about raw horsepower, though they have plenty. They're about balancing massive power with efficiency and emissions control. But thanks to advances like common rail fuel injection, variable geometry turbos, and sophisticated electronics, these modern monsters have learned how to play nice with the environment. Plus, the 16V149 TIB's two-stroke design, while noisy and smoky, was a masterclass in power density, squeezing out more power per liter than many four-strokes of its day. Today's engines are mostly four-stroke, partly because emissions rules are brutal, but the idea of packing insane power into a smaller package? That's a direct legacy. Although the 16V149 TIB was kicked out of the game, this smoke-belching beast from the 70s and 80s was low-key a glimpse of the future. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, let's do the math. The 16V149 TIB was a two-stroke diesel, which already gave it a power-to-weight ratio that embarrassed a lot of four-strokes. While everyone else was building big, heavy, slow-spinning engines, Detroit Diesel said, "Nah, let's spin it faster and squeeze out more power per pound." This thing revved to 2,100 RPM, a joke for a gas engine, but wild for something displacing 24.4 liters and pushing over 6,000 pound-feet of torque. Then there's the twin-turbo setup with intercooling. Today, every performance diesel worth its salt comes turbocharged, cooled, and electronically tuned. The 16V149 TIB had the turbo plus intercooler combo back when computer-controlled injection was science fiction. Then take a look at what companies like Wärtsilä, MTU, and even Caterpillar are doing. Multi-stage turbos, modular serviceability, integrated cooling systems, all things this Detroit monster was already flirting with 40-plus years ago. Even some electric vehicle architectures borrow the modular block philosophy that Detroit Diesel championed with the 71, 92, and 149 series. You could replace one cylinder head without tearing down the whole engine. Who else was thinking that far ahead back then? The only thing it didn't have was emissions control, and that's what finally caught up with it. So yeah, while today's engines are smarter, cleaner, and arguably more efficient, a lot of what makes them tick was already being tested, loudly and unapologetically, inside the 16V149 TIB. It was big, brash, and about 30 years early to the party. Now, modern engines seem to be doing better, but the truth is, a lot of them are still playing catch-up. That's right, they're still trying to match some of its raw power and ruggedness, even if they're way cleaner and smarter. Take the Caterpillar C175-20, for example. It's a 20-cylinder, four-stroke diesel that pumps out around 4,500 horsepower. Sounds impressive, right? But it's bigger, heavier, and slower to rev than the old Detroit diesel monster. Plus, the 16V149 TIB's 6,000-plus pound-feet torque still gives it bragging rights for sheer grunt. Caterpillar's engine relies on complex emission systems and electronic controls to meet today's standards, which add weight and complexity. Or look at Wärtsilä's 31 engine, a marine diesel powerhouse designed for efficiency and low emissions. It uses advanced turbocharging and electronic fuel injection that the 16V149 TIB could only dream of. Still, it runs at lower RPMs and sacrifices some of that untamed torque that made Detroit's Vice 16 a legend. Even the mighty Cummins QSK95 with its 95-liter displacement and up to 4,400 horsepower can't quite match the 16V149 TIB's torque numbers. It trades some of that muscle for cleaner emissions and better fuel economy, but in pure raw force, Detroit's engine still haunts the torque charts. So yeah, today's engines are way cleaner and smarter, they last longer, they're easier on the planet, and they've got digital brains controlling every drop of fuel. But when it comes to old-school muscle, the 16V149 TIB still casts a long shadow, reminding us that sometimes raw mechanical guts matter just as much as fancy tech. As expected, the world changed, regulations tightened, and technology marched on. So what came next? Who stepped up to the plate to replace this beast, and how did they compare? Just so you know, it's not a clear-cut win. When the big two-stroke engines, including the 16V149 TIB, started looking like relics in the eyes of regulators and many buyers. The world quickly moved into the four-stroke era. One of the main successors was the Detroit Diesel Series 60, launched in 1987. This was a four-stroke inline-six diesel engine, quite a shift from the massive two-stroke V16. The Series 60 came with turbocharging and advanced electronic controls, a big deal back then, that helped it run cleaner and more efficiently. It had lower horsepower compared to the 16V149 TIB, usually topping out around 600 horsepower, but it was a smarter, more fuel-efficient, and emissions-friendly engine. Then there were the big dogs from Caterpillar, like the 3516 and 3508. These were V16 and V12 four-stroke diesel engines designed for heavy industrial and marine use. They boasted horsepower figures ranging from 1,000 to 2,000 and improved emissions controls. They were definitely powerful, but the Detroit Diesel 16V149 TIB still had it beat in raw output. However, these newer engines could run cleaner, longer, and with less maintenance fuss. Navistar's MaxForce 16 and Cummins QSK95 also came on the scene as advanced high-horsepower engines. They featured cutting-edge fuel injection and exhaust treatment systems to meet modern regulations. Again, their horsepower was competitive but generally capped lower than the old Detroit diesel giant. What about performance? The 16V149 TIB's brute strength and rapid RPM range gave it instant grunt and fast response, perfect for big, demanding tasks. But the newer four-strokes focused more on efficiency, durability, and meeting environmental rules. It's like trading a muscle car for a hybrid. One's raw power, the other's smarter and more considerate. So did these newer engines really replace the 16V149 TIB in every way? Not exactly. For certain heavy-duty marine and industrial applications, some still prefer two-stroke technology for that sheer, unrelenting power. But the Detroit Diesel 16V149 TIB's heyday ended mostly because it couldn't meet pollution standards without costly redesigns. So that's the story of the 16V149 TIB, a powerful and rugged engine that left a lasting mark in its era. It was eventually banned, mainly because it couldn't meet tightening emissions regulations. This engine pushed the limits of what diesel power plants could do, delivering torque and horsepower numbers that few others could match. It set a benchmark for heavy-duty performance that still influences engine design today. While it may have been a bit out of step with the world moving toward cleaner, smarter technology, it remains an impressive example of raw mechanical muscle. Whether it was ahead of its time or just a beast that didn't fit the new rules, Detroit Diesel's V16 deserves recognition as a milestone in engine engineering. It's a chapter worth revisiting for anyone interested in the history of diesel power and the trade-offs between power and progress.